It's on. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Chillmark Book Festival. Thanks for coming. It's a wonderful every other year event, and as you know, it's free, but donations are really welcome. For a $25 donation, you get you get a canvas book bag. Donations can be made at the information tent, and bags can be purchased there as well. We're really, really excited to start today with the wonderful Carol Anderson, who will be talking about her book, White Rage, and is going to be interviewed, well, you can clap. She's going to be interviewed by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and we'll get to that as soon as I just thank other people who are important to thank. We'll have questions at the end of the interview. The author will be signing books in the signing tent and selling books, so we hope that you'll visit with her then. And I think that's it for right now. Oh, there's also food for sale if you're hungry behind the Art Shack. So without further ado, thank you so much. Yeah.
Well, hello, I'm Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and it's really my great pleasure to interview the author Carol Anderson on this amazing book. Carol Anderson is the professor of African American Studies at Emory University. Her research focuses on public policy relating to race, justice, and equality, and her most recent book is White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Nation's Divide, which won the 2017 National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism. So let's give her a hand. So let's start, Carol.
Okay.
So, I remember from the tumultuous 60s, that was my generation, two black psychiatrists, William Greer and Price Cobbs, wrote a book called Black Rage. And when we think of rage, we think of violent actions and outbursts, and yet your discussion of white rage is quite a different perspective. Something much more subtle, more calculated, innovative, and governmentally systemic. And it characterizes, as you tell us, several periods in American history. So I'd like for you to talk about this to the group.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. And I also want to thank George Gibson, who was my incredible publisher editor for White Rage. He helped shepherd this book. Let me just start at the beginning. First, there was man, and then, no.
I think it was God.
God, right? Is that I'm watching the television as Ferguson is blowing up. And I'm seeing the flames and the fire, and I'm listening to the pundits. And it didn't matter whether I was listening to MSNBC or CNN or, yes, even Fox. What I was hearing was the same story, regardless of despite the ideological bent of any of those venues. And that was Black Rage. Look at black folks burning up where they live. Can you believe they're burning up where they live? Did you know they were burning up where they live? What kind of people burn up where they live? Did I tell you they were burning up where they lived? And I'm just sitting there and I'm going, Because part of that is I had lived in Missouri for 13 years. This would be Missouri that now has the NAACP travel advisory. And what wasn't discussed in all of this burning up where they lived were the policies that had systematically undermined and eroded and devalued and debased African American citizenship rights. What no one was talking about in all that, look at where they're burning up where they live, was that the school district where Michael Brown, where he graduated from, Missouri has an accreditation system that accredits each school system 140 points. numbers of students who graduate, numbers who are in AP honors, numbers who are doing this, numbers who are doing that. And you get points, and you can get up to 140. Michael Brown's school system had 10 for 15 years. It was still not accredited when he died. But nobody was talking about that. Instead, you heard these little snickers. Yeah, they call him a college student. He's going to a trade school. But they weren't talking about how policymakers had systematically undermined the right to education in the United States for people who had been fighting so hard to be educated. In fact, what we had done as a society was to punish black people for valuing education. That is what we had systematically done. And I mean, I saw that with the right to vote, where 67% of Ferguson is African American. The voter turnout rate in 2013 was 6%. The work that it takes to transform 67% to 6%, that's policy. And and part of this is also if we always identify rage as this violence, then we miss so much the incredible damage that is done by the cool, corrosive, systematic policies. Because think about what happens to all of those children who have come through a school system that can only manage 10 points on a 140 scale. The damage is much broader, much deeper, much more systemic than burning a cross. And so it was to really, as I said, to blow graphite onto a fingerprint so that we could track white rage over time. And I've got to say that the trigger for white rage is not just the presence of black people. The trigger for white rage are black people who aspire, black people who achieve, black people who insist upon their basic human and civil rights. It is that is the trigger for white rage. That black advancement creates a massive policy backlash set out to undermine and erode that advancement.
So, if you could give some examples, because one of the rich characteristics of the book is your command of history. And you show a long history of presumptions that black people are asking for, quote, special treatment, when what they're really asking for are constitutional rights. Yeah. And one of the examples thank you, and one of the examples that you use is literally right after Reconstruction, right after the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which was shepherded by our, as I say, senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner. Now, we, for the first time, had a law that would give us progress. And by 1883, of course, that was struck down. But share that about Justice Bradley. And the other thing is just the way advocates for, quote, colorblind, because it's amazing to me the way the supporters of equality in the 19th century used colorblind quite differently in its connotation than today.
Thank you. And one of the things that struck me, Mark Twain supposedly have said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure do rhyme. And I was struck by the rhythms that I kept seeing over and over that had the same resonance, the same cadence. It might have a bit of a different pitch, but it was the same beat. And so the first time I saw this, they're asking for special treatment. I went, wow. Because this was an opinion of Justice Bradley, I think in 1883. And I'm going, okay, so we've just come out of slavery and Reconstruction that was barely reconstructed. We are now in this really kind of netherland where the Supreme Court is beginning to pull back and erode all of the laws that the radical Republican Congress, and I know, doesn't it feel good to say radical Republican, had put in place that dealt with, for instance, that to get rid of the Ku Klux Klan, saying that kind of domestic terrorism has no place on American soil. Wow. To say that African American men had the right to vote. Wow. To say that there would be equal protection under the law and due process. Wow. This is like landmark. But you know, we're dealing with a system that had been put in place since 1619. So we're dealing with centuries of massive human rights violations on a scale that is virtually unimaginable. To then have, and after the Civil War, we had such political backlash. I mean, the South rose up almost immediately with the black codes. And so it's taking, this isn't like flipping a switch and it's over. This is continued resistance. So to then have the judge say, I am so sick and tired of all of these black people coming to the courts, trying to get their little special privileges. When are they just going to accept that they're American citizens and just quit begging the courts for something special? And I thought, special? They were asking to have the 15th Amendment enforced so that they would have the right to vote. They were asking to have the 14th Amendment enforced so that they would have equal protection under the law. They were asking to have the 13th Amendment enforced so that they would not have to deal with the badges of servitude. But instead, to ask to have the Constitution enforced meant that they were asking for special privileges. And so let me then carry this forward to Bakke, because we're in the affirmative action mode again, still. With Bakke, the Bakke case. So we know that the civil rights movement, 1950s, 1960s, by 70, you get the affirmative action that says, okay, we realize that we're going to have to do something a little bit different if we're going to open up this society, because even after the Civil War, we didn't open up this society. By 1977, so we've got basically 7 years, the Supreme Court rules that, one, that quotas are bad. You can't use quotas. But they also rule that affirmative action cannot be used to deal with to ameliorate the past discrimination that this entity had caused. So you look at a University of Texas that didn't open up its admissions until dragging, kicking, and screaming until like the late 1960s, early 1970s. You're looking at Alabama, the same thing. UGA with Charlotte, these places are fighting hard. 7 years, it's like, no. And this is why you get the language of diversity. Instead, that was an amen church over there. I knew this was Sunday morning. Yes. But get the cadence. Uh-huh. Right? Okay. So that, so that you get the language of diversity, where they're trying to then make the rationale for what has been hundreds of years of exclusion, racial exclusion. Now, at the same time, you don't have that argument about legacies. Now, if what you have done is to systematically close off your university.
It's like the grandfather clause.
Thank you. It is the grandfather clause. If you have closed off your university to black people, and then you still have this large number of students that you let in because they are the children of alums, then what you have said is that you have automatically built in an all white, whites only will be white chunk of your admissions based on racial exclusion. We don't argue about legacies. What we know for the Ivy Leagues, for instance, is that there are more legacies admitted than there are black students. But the focus has been on black students because they're asking for something special. I mean, and so we get that language over and over again, and what it requires is historical erasure. It requires that we don't understand how this nation was built, how its policies were formed, what was driving it, and what the consequences were. Mm-hmm. And so in White Rage, I set out to make that history visible.
I don't know if the people in the audience know that Carol is a scholar also of international history, and she has written 2 wonderful books on African American efforts to fight against colonialism in Africa and to fight against the apartheid regime. This would have been in the earlier part of the 20th century. And I'm just wondering, with that internationalist perspective, were there any lessons about America? Did you find any relevance to that?
Oh, my first book was called Eyes Off the Prize. The United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights. And what I saw there were that, one, African Americans, we often write the history of black people as a very myopic, shuttered history, that, they focused only in on this thing that they were dealing with right there in Mississippi and in their county in Mississippi. And that appears to be it, and that they have no vision of the broader world. That wasn't the case at all. Their vision was so broad because what they said was that oppression is global. Mm-hmm. And we have to fight global oppression. I liken it to extermination. When a place is infested with roaches, you can't just fix what's happening in that one apartment. You have to exterminate it throughout the building. And that kind of global oppression, they were saying, had to be wiped out globally, because fixing it in, say, Ghana was not going to solve the problem in Georgia. Fixing it in Georgia wasn't going to solve the problem in Ghana. And they worked in coalitions with freedom fighters in those other lands. They went to the United Nations articulating their vision. And so part of what I saw in all of this was an incredible sense of awareness and an incredible sense of mobilization, of activism, of presence, of self. And I also saw how there was a leitmotif in terms of oppression. So for instance, in South Africa, they had what they called Bantu education, which was the education that was deemed the best for Africans. And basically it was to create workers, nothing more. And you saw massive disparities in funding. I saw the same kind of numbers then when I'm looking at the funding of education for black students in the United States, where for instance, you're getting massive areas that don't have high schools. You're getting massive areas where you've got disparities that are sometimes 10, 20 times differential between the funding for white schools and the funding for black schools. But yet we will look at those black schools and say, all you got to do is, if you really valued education, is just work hard. And funding really doesn't make a difference in the quality of education.
I know, my late husband, Leon Higginbotham, was a judge for many years, and he used to write about South Africa as well as United States. And he has written that the South African laws of apartheid, they actually learned some of what they created in those laws from our segregation laws, which also brings me to this question of the long periods of time of the ability to just execute unjust policies, and that somehow gets accepted. I mean, on the one hand, it is inspiring, awe-inspiring to think of Black perseverance. But on the other hand, it is really, I think, troubling to know that you have a Supreme Court, let's say Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, that would say, separate but equal, rule it, is the law of the land. There was one lone dissenting justice, John Harlan, and this is what he said: "The thin disguise of equal accommodations will not mislead anyone, nor atone for the wrong done this day." It was really clear to him, as it became clear to all of us. But you give so many great examples of fundamental rights, like the right of movement, freedom of the press, like, what happens when the Supreme Court finally does decide in favor of integrated schools, and then places in Virginia just close their whole schools down. Talk about this.
So, the freedom of movement, I'll start there. Great Migration. We have, as part of our foundational narrative in America, is that this is the land of opportunity. And where there's opportunity, that's where you go. In the Great Migration, you had 1.5 million African Americans leaving the South. That's about 10% of the population. That is huge. That is seismic. Well, the South looked up, and this is right starts off during the First World War, because there are incredible opportunities. The war has started. Europeans are going back over to fight in the Great War, World War I. And so the manufacturing is gearing up for war material, and they need labor. And they look around and they're like, you know what, there's some Black folks in the South. Who knew? And so they start sending labor agents in the South to recruit African Americans to come north, come to Chicago, come to Pittsburgh, and the movement starts. The South looks up and goes, no, and then starts putting in place. Yes, you'll have the lynching, but what they're putting in place are the laws. The laws. One of the things that they did was they banned the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender was the prominent Black newspaper in the United States. And the Chicago Defender had been absolutely essential to the Great Migration. It had in there listings of jobs, listings of opportunities, listings of housing, listings of where you could go, coming in, say, from Mississippi, coming in from Alabama. Stop here. This is the place where then we can get you set up. Once the South began to figure out that the Chicago Defender was one of the conduits, it was like Voices of America, right? Voice of America, one of the conduits of information about freedom. They said, oh no, banned it. Now, I know that there's this thing called the First Amendment that has something called freedom of the press. I mean, it's kind of freedom of the press. But here what we saw was that the South said, no, you do not have this freedom. And there was no hue and cry pushback from the federal government in the banning of the Chicago Defender. But Black folks resisted. My mother talked about my granddaddy. And
Where was he?
Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is the South. Let's be real clear. It is the South.
Well, they had slaves.
Yes, it is the South. And she talked about how granddaddy would take that Chicago Defender, fold it, put it under his arm, and then get his walk on. Go, yeah, I got my fender, right? It was a badge of courage. It was a badge of strength. It was a badge of resilience. One of the other things that the South did, particularly in Mississippi, now remember, we're in the middle of a war. You got war material that has to be moved. You got troops that need to be moved. Mississippi stopped the trains. Just stopped the trains. Black people were getting on those trains to go north. Mississippi said, no, we'll just stop the trains. It took a federal marshal to say, what are you doing? You can't do this. And the sheriffs were like, well, yeah, we can. And the feds were like, we're getting ready to arrest you. We are in the middle of a war. Now, it took a middle of a war, and finally they were like, okay, we'll release the trains. But then they started arresting Black people who had tickets and calling them vagrants. And with vagrancy, then you could lock them up, then have them bailed out by whites to then work on plantations. I mean, so we're fighting a war to make the world safe for democracy. And this is what is going on. And so part of what makes this so is that it's so legalistic. That you don't see the violence. And this is a nation that is drawn to the spectacular. And so when you get these little civil codes and state laws that are then just carried out by officials, it doesn't have that same, but it is devastating.
And you're bringing me to today because I'd like for you to talk about President Obama's election as a catalyst for voter suppression. We hear all this conversation about voter fraud, when in fact we have much more voter suppression.
Okay, yes. In White Rage, I go through these moments of where African Americans have achieved some semblance of their citizenship rights, and then look at the massive backlash in terms of policy. The election of Barack Obama to the presidency was a huge victory for Black America.
And 2 times.
Whew.
All of America, that is right.
Well, except not all of America, because there were large segments of America who thought they were looking at the apocalypse, who saw a Black man in the White House and thought the world as they knew it was over, particularly the Republicans. And let me explain why. Barack Obama's organizing ability brought in over 15 million new voters into American democracy. This is something we should be applauding. The Republicans looked at this and had a Scooby-Doo moment. Oh, Shaggy. Because what they saw in there, 2 million new African American voters, 2 million new Hispanic voters, 600,000 new Asian voters, and the growth in voters who made $15,000 a year or less was almost exponential. Those are the folks you say you want invested in democracy. Because when people are invested in the nation, they become part of the solution. They help build. They make the nation stronger. They bring that kind of diversity of ideas and commitments to the fore. Instead, what happened was that the Republicans looked at this, and they had been working on the language of voter fraud for a while, because they had to figure out, how do we shut this thing down? Because the party had moved so far to the right. So far to the right. And I would say it's because they brought the toxin of the Southern strategy. They brought that racism into the party. They wooed it into the party in 1968. And the more they brought it in, the more right-wing that party became, until you don't even, as I said, Lord, I miss my Republicans. So they couldn't develop policies that then spoke to the poor, to Hispanics, to African Americans, to Asian Americans. They couldn't speak to the broader group of Americans. They spoke to a strata of overwhelmingly, it's like 92% of the Republican Party is white. So they spoke to a strata of America. And so what they did is they began to figure out how to shut it down. But they couldn't just go boom, because that would violate the 15th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act. And so what they did was to say, we need to ensure the integrity of the ballot box. White rage works beautifully because it cloaks its devious methods in the language of democracy. It swaddles it in the flag. It swaddles it in common sense language. So you get voter IDs. We need to ensure the integrity of the ballot box. So we need to make sure that you are who you are when you vote. That sounds like, well, yeah, I need a ID to get a book out of a library. How hard can that be? I can see that. But then it's how they implement it. Let's take Alabama. So Alabama first says, okay, so you need a voter ID. And then what Alabama does in the Black Belt counties, and those are the counties that have a large, it's either equal or more African Americans in that county than there are whites. They shut down the Department of Motor Vehicles in all of the Black Belt counties. And what they said, now it sounded for fiscal responsibility. With keeping these places open all the time is just draining the treasury, and we have to be fiscally responsible. Now, I've got to say there were two areas where they didn't shut them down. At Selma and Montgomery. Right? But they figured they could shut them down in all of the other ones and nobody would notice. So, and these were the counties in Alabama that voted overwhelmingly for Barack Obama. We have voter ID laws. Now, let me back up. There was a huge hue and cry afterwards. And so what Governor Bentley did was he said, fine, I'll open them. And people are like, okay, great. But now they're open 1 day a month. So begin to think about what your access looks like to your right to vote. So the pattern is you create an obstacle, and then you create an obstacle to the obstacle. We had millions of American citizens who were denied their right to vote in the 2016 election based on voter suppression, the backlash to the presidency of Barack Obama.
I have one last question before we go to you. And I bet this is a question that many of you have. So your book came out before the election.
Yeah.
What are you thinking now? Now, when you look at the New York Times today in the op-ed section, you will see. She has a great article, The Policies of White Resentment. But just say a few words, and then we'd love to hear from you.
And what I set out to, what I think now is that it is white rage that put Donald Trump in the White House. Between the voter suppression, that in fact, when you're looking at what happened in Wisconsin, and when you're looking at felony disfranchisement in Florida, that wipes out about 25% of all black voters in Florida. And those two states had the electoral college votes that put him over the top. When you think about, you had a field of 16 Republican candidates, governors, senators who had experience, and the electorate went for the man who was the most un-Obama. Remember Jeffrey Holder's The Un-Cola, right? The most anti-Obama because of his birtherism. That birtherism gave him a badge, a stamp that no other Republican could match. That's what put him over. And when you think about what an unholy mess this regime has been, just one debacle after the next, as you watch the standing of the U.S. just plummet, as you have diplomats just laughing at the U.S., as you have our inability to follow through on our commitments, when you're,
Okay.
yes.
Please read the article.
Yes.
We're trying to get her blood pressure down. So we have a few minutes, and you'll tell me when to stop. So if you have questions, I know somebody has a question.
So, as an educator, I'm often appalled at the lack of knowledge of American history among our students or even our teachers. And it seems this past election, there seems to be a lot of really uneducated voters. And so I've read a lot about the Scandinavian education system, which is by no means perfect, but their policies really changed when they focused on equity and having everyone have an equal chance to get into the system. How does the United States move to that, and what do we do to promote that?
To me, the thing that has to happen in the United States, where we can move to equity, where we can see that when we all are doing well, the nation is doing well, is that whites have to have the conversation about what real American history looks like around their dinner table. They have to have that conversation with their brothers, their sisters, their uncles. I can't tell you how many times I heard during 2016 where someone would talk about what was happening around their dinner table and they were like, yeah, go Trump, and it didn't matter. And that they were spewing things that, well, whites built this nation and by God, we're going to keep it. When you have that kind of history, then it makes it very difficult to even talk about equity because you honestly believe that whites built this nation all by themselves. and it stops right there. So having a factual historical understanding and whites engaging in the work of equity building. This cannot just be what black folks do or what Latinos do. Whites have got to be fully engaged in this conversation. Our nation is at risk. I mean, we see this.
My question goes to, it was a question I wanted you to answer the other day, but you didn't get a chance. But my question goes to the fact that at the heart of this is really, I think, and you can react to it, the fact that we were chattel, and not slaves, but chattel slaves, which is a big difference between slaves and chattel slaves, and that we've been seeking to be human in the eyes of the majority population since that time. So the struggle seems to be that we were chattel, and so the attitude is that we're chattel still. And so when you look at Michael Brown, and you look at the school systems, you look at the policies, these are policies against people who were not considered, they were chattel. And so now it seems like the struggle has been trying to be, for all these years, since the 1600s, trying to prove that we're human. You want to react to that?
It has been the struggle of recognizing our humanity, of having this system recognize that humanity. I mean, and we see it over and over again. I teach a civil rights movement class, and I talk about the politics of respectability, for instance. And the politics of respectability is that thing where if you go to school, you don't drink, you have that kind of middle class visage, then boom, you too can access the American dream if you are respectable. And so you get this kind of, this is why Rosa Parks and not Claudette Colvin. Okay. But what that strategy was about identifying and forcing the broader society to recognize the humanity of African Americans by saying, when you're looking at a Mrs. Amelia Boynton down in Selma, who is about as middle class, she's a school teacher, she's got on her stockings and her kitten heels, and you have Sheriff Jim Clark just snatching her as she's trying to register to vote. You can't point to a narrative that says, oh, well, she's a thug, and that's why the cops were going after her. Instead, this is a respectable woman who is being beaten by the sheriff because she's trying to register to vote. So that element of respectability used in the civil rights movement was about trying to get this society to recognize that black people were people. Ibram Kendi, who wrote Stamped from the Beginning, what he talks about there is that what black people are really looking for is not this special treatment that keeps eddying through and all this, but it is the ability to soar when you can soar. It is the ability to fail when you can fail. And that it's not seen as somehow your failure is representative of the race. Your failure is just because you failed. But that's not what happens here. In this incredible battle to pull from being enslaved. Lord have mercy. To say, I am human. That is where we are right now. It is what allows Philando Castile to be gunned down in his car. And you don't hear a mumbling word from the NRA. Because they did not see a human being there gunned down. Instead, you had all of this narrative about, well, you know, maybe he smoked weed. Really? That's what I mean. Yeah.
I think on that note, which is an emotional climax to many interesting and provocative points that Carol brought up, is a good time to stop. We thank Carol very much.
Wow.
Very well done, folks. We all appreciate that, and we thank Evelyn as well. Please make your way.